In 1863, a Confederate customs officer watched a woman in a wide hoop skirt glide past his checkpoint. He didn't stop her. He didn't search her. He tipped his hat. Underneath that skirt, nearly $6,000 worth of quinine, morphine, and revolver parts. Enough medicine to treat hundreds of wounded soldiers, and enough steel to arm dozens more. He never knew. For centuries, the world's smugglers, spies, and rebels shared one closely guarded secret. If you wanted something to cross a border unseen, you didn't send a man, you sent a woman. Not because women were braver, not because they were more skilled, because they were invisible. This is the story of how the very things society used to control women, their clothing, their delicacy, their assumed helplessness, became the greatest smuggling technology in history. And it's a story that stretches from powdered wigs and revolutionary tea parties all the way to modern airport security lines, because the loophole these women found wasn't really a hole in a wall. It was a hole in the imagination of the men guarding it. For most of modern history, women in public life were treated as something between property and porcelain. They weren't meant to be searched, questioned, or touched by strange men, even by soldiers, even by police. Searching a woman wasn't just impractical. In many societies, it was a scandal, an accusation of impropriety, sometimes a crime in itself. That single social rule, you do not touch a lady, created a blind spot the size of a battlefield, and women walked straight through it, over and over, for generation after generation, in war after war, until the pattern became so consistent that historians now treat it less as a series of individual tricks and more as an entire hidden infrastructure of resistance. Long before the Civil War, women were already exploiting this blind spot. During the American Revolution, colonial women were used as couriers precisely because British soldiers considered searching a woman beneath their dignity, and occasionally illegal under their own military codes of conduct. Women carried messages sewn into the hems of dresses, folded into hollowed-out heels, and tucked beneath bonnets. One of the most famous, a teenager named Sybil Luddington, rode 40 miles through the night to warn militia of a British attack, a ride twice the length of Paul Revere's, largely forgotten by history for the same reason her contemporaries were never suspected of anything. Nobody expected a girl to be dangerous. The pattern had already been set. It would repeat for the next 200 years. During the American Civil War, the hoop skirt became one of the most effective smuggling devices ever designed, not by engineers, but by necessity. The cage-like steel frame beneath a woman's dress created a hollow, swinging space nearly 4 feet in diameter. Southern women, and Union sympathizers moving in the other direction, packed that space with exactly what armies were desperate for: quinine to fight malaria, morphine for the wounded, sewing needles, buttons, pistol parts, and letters carrying troop positions. Confederate blockade runners called their skirted couriers the silent cavalry. One woman could carry what took 2 mules to haul, and no soldier at a checkpoint was going to lift her dress to check. Historians estimate that by 1864, so much contraband was moving beneath hoop skirts that Union officers in some border towns began publishing warnings about suspiciously large crinolines. But warnings only went so far. Searching a woman still required a female officer, and few armies had one anywhere near the front lines. The dress designed to make women decorative and immobile had quietly become armor for the resistance. Women like Belle Boyd and Elizabeth Van Lew went even further, using their assumed harmlessness not just to carry goods but to gather and deliver military intelligence directly to commanding generals, intelligence that shaped the outcome of real battles. Van Lew ran an entire spy ring out of Richmond, the Confederate capital itself, hiding messages inside hollowed-out eggs and vegetable baskets, delivered by servants nobody thought to question either. The lesson generals on both sides eventually learned, too late to fully act on it. An army's greatest vulnerability isn't always at its walls. Sometimes it's in the assumptions of the men standing guard at them. If the hoop skirt was the first great trick, the second was even bolder: pretending to be pregnant. Across occupied Europe during World War II, resistance networks in France, Poland, Belgium, and the Netherlands used the same quiet exploit again and again. A woman with a pregnant belly wasn't searched. She was offered a seat. She was waved ahead in line. Soldiers who might interrogate a suspicious man for hours would glance at a visibly pregnant woman and simply look away, some out of decency, some out of superstition, some because touching her felt like touching a live wire of public shame. Underneath the padding, radio components, printing plates for underground newspapers, detonators, sometimes documents forging entire new identities for downed Allied airmen. The women who did this were called passeuses, the ones who passed through. Many were teenagers. Some carried messages sewn into hemlines. Others carried parts of disassembled rifles strapped flat against their bodies beneath nursing-style maternity dresses, one leg of a pistol grip at a time, trip after trip, until an entire weapon existed on the other side of a border that had never seen it cross. One captured courier, when interrogated by a German officer who suspected, correctly, that her pregnancy was fake, reportedly replied, "Then arrest me for being fat, Herr Offizier. I dare you to write that report." He didn't. Because writing that report meant admitting he'd spent 20 minutes debating whether to feel a stranger's stomach in public. And that admission was its own kind of defeat. In Poland, the underground resistance, the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, relied on an entire generation of young women known as łączniczki, or liaison couriers. They moved between cells of the resistance carrying weapons, forged papers, and coded messages, often disguised not as pregnant women but as nurses, schoolgirls, or nuns, roles so steeped in assumed innocence that German checkpoints rarely gave them a second glance. One courier, Krystyna Skarbek, later known by the code name Christine Granville, became one of the most decorated Allied agents of the entire war, smuggling intelligence across the Carpathian Mountains on skis, often relying on nothing more than charm and the simple fact that no one expected a woman to be doing what she was doing. She once talked her way past an SS checkpoint by claiming to be the niece of a local collaborator, a lie so audacious that the soldiers apologized to her for the inconvenience. That single sentence captures the entire pattern of this story. The disguise wasn't the trick. The trick was making the men in charge feel rude for suspecting her at all. Nothing disarmed a soldier, a customs agent, or a policeman faster than an actual baby. During periods of famine, war, and prohibition, women didn't just fake pregnancy. Some used real infants as cover, tucking contraband into the folds of blankets, the false bottoms of prams, and the linings of diaper bags. In Prohibition-era America, bootlegging networks in cities like Chicago and Detroit relied on women pushing baby carriages, loaded not with children, but with bottles of whiskey wrapped in swaddling cloth, sometimes with a real sleeping child balanced right on top. Police in New York and Chicago eventually caught on, but eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence. For years, baby carriage bootlegging was one of the most profitable, least policed corners of the entire liquor trade, precisely because arresting a woman with an infant in public was a public relations disaster no officer wanted his name attached to. The genius wasn't the hiding place. Prams weren't hard to search. The genius was the social cost of searching one. During Prohibition, the Detroit River, barely half a mile wide at its narrowest point, became one of the busiest smuggling corridors in North America. And some of its most reliable couriers weren't gangsters at all. They were ordinary housewives, crossing daily on the ferry with grocery baskets, hat boxes, and, in winter, layers of heavy coats. Border agents on both sides quickly noticed something odd. Certain women seemed to cross the river constantly, sometimes several times a day, always with baskets of laundry or produce. But questioning a respectable-looking housewife felt, to many agents, almost beneath the job. Some later admitted they simply didn't want the argument that would follow if they were wrong. One smuggler, later interviewed for a newspaper feature decades after Prohibition ended, described strapping bottles to her body underneath a large winter coat and walking across the frozen river in broad daylight, waving to the same customs officer every single day. He always tipped his hat, she said. That was the whole trick. Make sure he keeps tipping his hat. Clothing did more than hide objects. It hid identity. In Nazi-occupied territories, Jewish resistance couriers, many of them women in their teens and 20s, relied on a brutal irony. Anti-Semitic stereotypes of the era were built entirely around men. Propaganda posters obsessed over the appearance of Jewish men. Young Jewish women, dressed in the fashion of the occupying culture, speaking the local language without an accent, often moved through checkpoints that would have doomed their brothers instantly. Historian accounts describe couriers like Vladka Meed, who smuggled weapons, documents, and information in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto by relying on exactly this blind spot, presenting as an ordinary young Polish woman, invisible to a system that had been designed to hunt for someone who didn't look like her at all. This is the darkest version of the same pattern running through this entire story. Powerful systems build their defenses around the threats they expect, and every system that expects danger to look male, or foreign, or poor, or young, leaves a door standing wide open for anyone who doesn't fit that picture. Women didn't just exploit sexism. In the worst moments of the 20th century, they exploited the entire architecture of who a system was trained to fear. Similar networks operated in the ghettos of Vilna, Białystok, and Krakow, where young women were repeatedly chosen as couriers not for lack of danger. The danger, if caught, was execution, but because they had the best odds of survival long enough to complete the mission. They memorized messages rather than writing them down whenever possible, carried false papers memorized to the smallest detail, and learned to walk, speak, and dress in ways that erased every visible trace of who they actually were. Some carried grenades in loaves of bread. Others carried children who weren't their own across borders, posing as young mothers to move entire families to safety, one fabricated identity at a time. Their survival rate was still tragically low, but their success rate, measured in lives saved, weapons delivered, and warnings passed along in time, was extraordinary precisely because the machinery hunting them had never been built with them in mind. Fast forward to the drug corridors of the late 20th century, and the pattern hadn't changed. It had just changed uniforms. Well into the 1980s, customs and law enforcement in the US, UK, and across Latin America operated with search policies that were, in practice if not on paper, far gentler toward women, especially women who appeared to be mothers, tourists, or elderly. Cartels and smuggling networks noticed. Female couriers, sometimes called mules, were recruited specifically because searches of women required a female officer, additional paperwork, and, in the calculus of an overworked customs post at 2 a.m., additional hassle that many agents simply avoided. Studies conducted by criminologists in the 1990s later confirmed what smuggling networks had already figured out decades earlier. Women, particularly women who appeared to be traveling with children or dressed in a way coded as respectable, were statistically less likely to be stopped, less likely to be searched thoroughly, and less likely to be suspected at all, even when carrying equivalent or greater volumes of contraband than male counterparts on the very same routes. It wasn't that women were better smugglers, it was that the entire enforcement system had been built, unconsciously, by people who assumed the criminal on the other side of the counter would look like them. One of the most quietly effective versions of this pattern involved not young women, but older ones. Grandmothers, in particular, occupied a strange dead zone in the psychology of law enforcement, a demographic so far removed from the profile of criminal that even trained officers, when surveyed anonymously, admitted they rarely gave older women a second look. Smuggling networks in several documented cases specifically recruited women in their 60s and 70s as couriers for exactly this reason, paying them a fraction of what a younger courier might demand, precisely because the risk of detection was so much lower. It's a grim, almost mathematical exploitation of the same social invisibility that, in other centuries, women had used to save lives instead of launder profits. A reminder that the very same blind spot could be turned toward liberation or toward exploitation, depending entirely on who was standing on the other side of it. So why did this work, again and again, across centuries and continents? 3 reasons. First, chivalry as camouflage. Codes of politeness that were meant to protect women doubled as immunity. A man who wouldn't dream of frisking a lady had, without realizing it, built her a permanent blind spot. Second, the myth of the harmless woman. Institutions, armies, customs offices, police forces were run overwhelmingly by men who had been taught, explicitly or not, that women were incapable of serious criminal calculation. That assumption wasn't just wrong, it was load-bearing. Entire smuggling economies were built directly on top of it. Third, the cost of being wrong. Searching a woman and being wrong carried social consequences as searching a man never did. Accusations of impropriety, public embarrassment, career risk. Smugglers didn't need to defeat security systems. They only needed to make the personal cost of enforcing those systems higher than most officers were willing to pay. That's the real secret hiding underneath every hoop skirt, every false pregnancy, every baby carriage, and every calm walk through customs. It was never really about what was hidden. It was about who the world had trained itself not to look at. It would be a mistake to romanticize this too much. The blind spot wasn't a guarantee. When it failed, it often failed catastrophically, and the punishment for a woman caught smuggling was frequently harsher, socially, than for a man, precisely because she had violated not just the law, but the expectation of what a respectable woman was supposed to be. Captured couriers in occupied Europe faced the same firing squads as their male counterparts. Women caught bootlegging during Prohibition sometimes lost custody of their own children as a result of their arrest, a consequence rarely applied to men convicted of the same crime. The invisibility that protected women also meant that when they were finally seen, the reaction was often disproportionate, as though the system, embarrassed at having been fooled, needed to make an example of the exception in order to restore its own sense of order. This is worth sitting with, because it complicates the neat, almost triumphant version of this story. The loophole was real, the courage was real, but the cost of being caught exploiting it was very rarely equal between men and women, and in many cases, it still isn't. Modern security systems have, slowly, closed many of these gaps. Metal detectors don't care about hoop skirts. X-ray scanners don't respect chivalry. Female officers are now standard at most serious checkpoints, specifically because of decades of exploitation like this. But the underlying lesson outlived the loophole. Every security system, whether it's a customs checkpoint, a corporate firewall, or an algorithm scanning for fraud, is a mirror of the assumptions of the people who built it. And history shows, over and over, that the fastest way to move through any system undetected isn't brute force. It's simply being the person nobody thought to imagine. From colonial couriers riding through the night, to Confederate women swaying past checkpoints in steel-cage skirts, to teenagers skiing across mountain passes with intelligence sewn into their coats, to grandmothers with rolling suitcases decades later, the through line is the same. Every generation of women who moved the unmovable did it not by overpowering the systems built to stop them, but by understanding those systems better than the men who ran them ever did. They knew what the guards were looking for, and they made sure it was never them. For hundreds of years, women turned the world's low expectations of them into the most reliable smuggling route in history. Not with weapons, not with force, with a skirt, a smile, and the simple, devastating fact that no one was watching.